am busy with the recruitment and selection process, and we're looking at how, what role the SGB must play. But I've realized that this information is very valuable for the SMTs as well. And if you look at last week's replay, then you'll see that people like Lance asked incisive questions. So it's good to go back and just check, what people have asked and what the responses were, because we covered quite a bit of ground in terms of the post-filling process, and we looked at the different scenarios. So today we're going to focus on the selection process, and I'm hoping that we'll cover everything that you would like us to cover, right? So I'm going to start straight away. Let me just see if there's anybody else I need to greet. No, not yet. I have greeted generally. So guys, let me switch over quickly. Yeah, okay. So you'll notice that this screen here, I'll have to just tilt it like this now. But this is basically, if we go to page 1, it's just the selection process. So I thought I'll first give my input, and then afterwards you guys can ask the questions, right? So when we talk about the selection process that the governing body must conduct, then we're basically looking at their business process around the selection. And so the first thing that we must remember is that the governing body must be fully constituted. In other words, there shouldn't be any vacancies on the governing body. If there are, then you'll have to co-opt members so that you are fully constituted, because only when the governing body is fully constituted can you make decisions on the recruitment and selection. So that must take place. And then, of course, the SGB must have a meeting. And usually the SGB is going to select or elect an interview committee. And that interview committee will be acting on behalf of the SGB. Now, in some cases, you'll find that the entire SGB wants to be the interview committee. And so that can happen. But in many cases, people will just choose a few members of the SGB, and that SGB, those members will then be the interview committee. They will deliberate, they will meet, have all the meetings, deliberate on the selection process, go through the entire process, and then report back to the SGB, because the SGB has mandated them to do the job. They must go back to the SGB. SGB will then approve their decisions, and then once those decisions are approved or ratified by the SGB, that nomination that the SGB has made will then be sent to head office, and the only person who can do the appointment, as I think all of us know, is the head of department, the SG, the head of education, is the only one who can do an appointment. Now, if you check the preface, I think it's important. The preface makes it very clear. The preface to the vacancy list gives you the whole outline there. And it is stated that that preface must be made available to all staff members and to all your governing body members as well. So schools should either distribute that preface via the mailing system, the internal mail network, or in some cases, I suppose people will still give hard copies, but everybody should have access to the preface to the vacancy list, and you'll find a lot of detail in there, right? Oops, so I'm just touching on this. Maybe I should leave this like this because I'm running into serious trouble with this. I'm not even sure if you can see me at this point. Okay, there we go again. Guys, this program of mine, as commercial break quickly, these guys are very good, so they keep on changing things, and I'm still, struggling in terms of what I can do here. So you'll notice my camera is even different because I'm looking into a different camera at the moment. So that is about the SGB. Must be fully constituted. They must have a meeting. They must elect the interview committee. Like I said, it can either be the whole SGB will operate as the interview committee, or there will be a few members elected, and they will be given that mandate to run the post-filling process, all the selection processes right up to the nominations, which must then be ratified by the SGB. Okay, at the high school, remember our members are also part of the SGB, so do not exclude them, but you need to they must come to the meeting, and in most cases, your RCL members will step out because they will in fact decline to be part of that process, and then that must be minuted. But you can't assume that the learners are just not part of the process. They are part of the RCL. Legally, they must participate. So they must also be called to that initial meeting where you are going to discuss the fact that you're going to have to fill a particular post or posts. And then the RCL can then just excuse themselves from the process. Okay. So once you've done that, then we have to go, then you have the interview committee, and the interview committee is then going to meet and decide on a chair and the secretariat, right? So they have to decide on that. And then, of course, your interview committee must then develop a business plan where they give the timeline of how that post-filling process is going to take place and how the selection is going to happen. In that meeting also, the interview committee will have to decide, or follow-up meetings, but the interview committee will decide on what the shortlisting criteria will be. And the shortlisting criteria will, of course, be the same to a large extent for the short listing of the candidates that you are going to invite to the interview, and then, of course, the criteria that you need for the interview. All those things must be discussed prior to the actual process starting. And then, of course, the unions must be notified at least 5 working days before you start the process. And they must be given the dates and so forth. Okay, so that's the second part, which I'm going to explain in a little bit more detail. And then you get the third part where once the selection process has been concluded and the SGP has, or the interview committee has then, come up with the short list of nominees, then those nominees will then their names plus a motivation of why they have been, why they have been chosen will then be presented to the SGP. Okay, so that's just sort of in short what the process is. Now, let me go to the next part quickly. Page 2, but why am I not even getting page 2? Okay, there we go. Page 2. So, as I mentioned, you must have the date. So you must say exactly when you're going to do the shortlisting, on what date you're going to have the interviews, and all that must be discussed, right? There we go again. Gosh. Anyway, I'll just continue. And then you must discuss, what criteria you're going to use for the shortlisting, and you're going to have to speak to the core criteria, and the core criteria you will find in the advertisement. Remember, the advertisement will basically form the core criteria, and then your governing body, your interview committee will then have to decide, are they going to add additional criteria, and there must be motivation for that. There must be a reason why you want additional criteria, and you must also check if it's in line with everything that you want. Then, of course, the governing body needs to understand, or the IC in this case needs to understand, that the candidate who acted in a promotion post will have to be shortlisted. So it's got nothing to do with the person's CV. That person must be shortlisted. So you have to check on that information. Then you also have to check on the equity scores. Now, remember, we do apply the equity provision, and so the IC or governing body will receive the equity information from head office, and that equity scores will have to be applied, especially to our disadvantaged groups, and they will be all women fall under the disadvantaged groups, all black males, oh, there we're back again, all black males, African males, and of course, so African males, the women, and there's another, people with disabilities, right? So the equity scores, remember, equity is there to redress the disadvantages that people, the disadvantaged groups are being advantaged by the equity scores, but those equity scores will only be applied during your shortlisting process, so people are not like advantaged throughout the process. It's just they get that advantage, and then after that process ends there. Then, of course, the interview committee must also decide on the score metric. In other words, how are they going to finally score the candidates to decide who's going to be invited to the interview? So the score metric must be worked out. And then also, in most cases, there's a qualifying benchmarking score. In other words, the um, IC committee will have to agree on what is going to be the minimum score for a candidate to be considered to be invited to the interview, depending on how those shortlisted listed candidates will then be um, yeah, how those shortlisted candidates will be ranked. Okay, so I just sort of thought I'll just mention all these things. Then, of course, the interview committee must also agree on what is going to happen if there's a tie, if two candidates get the same score while they're busy shortlisting, then how are they going to resolve that issue? And then, of course, the IC must also discuss what's going to happen if there is a large score variance, if some people score very high, some people very low. How are you going to ensure that there's a balance, that, there's no unfairness in the process? And then, of course, we get to the next step, and I think this is what Zahir spoke about last week. He asked about the CBAs, the competency-based assessments, and that mechanism can be applied after you have shortlisted the 3 nominees that you would like the HOD to consider for appointment in the particular post that you are filling. And then, of course, the preface also speaks about interviews with referees. So that is also what the IC must discuss. How is that interview going to take place? Who's going to do it? What kind of guidelines are you going to record? Because you can't allow one person to have a particular conversation with one referee and then another member of the IC has a completely different conversation with the next, the other referee and so forth. So there must be discussion, there must be standardization around all these issues. And then, of course, how are you going to arrive at the shortlist for the interview? Like I said, what are you going to take into account? Are you going to take only the scores into account, or are you going to take into account also the discussions or deliberations that your IC will have? And then, given that discussion, will you then reach consensus? How are you going to finally arrive at your final shortlist for your interviews? And of course, that same process will apply when you are busy with after the interviews. What decisions will govern or guide the IC so that there is fairness throughout in the process, there's no bias, there's no prejudice. Okay, so for example, with the interview, let me speak about that later. Let me just see. Yes, I can see myself trying to crawl out at the back there. And then, of course, decisions to arrive at the shortlist or the merit list of the preferred nominees. So those are the aspects that your IC must discuss prior to you even opening or downloading those CVs. Remember, we have the e-recruitment system. So now you can no longer upload CVs that you have, that you've designed and developed on your own. You must populate that, all the fields on the e-recruitment, and then the e-recruitment system will generate a CV. So that will be the CV that will go to the IC, the interview committee. So you'll notice in the preface it says you mustn't upload any supporting documentation, but should you be shortlisted for the interview, then there are quite a few documents that you must take along. So it is critical that you read the preface to the vacancy list so that you understand. Okay, so that is to you, the prospective candidate for the various promotion posts of that vacancy list. And this applies to, of course, our SGB. And of course, I would imagine that the SMT must know all this information as well. Okay, so those are all the kinds of stuff that the interview committee must discuss prior to even looking at the CVs. And this process helps to prevent any kind of bias from creeping in, from people making decisions on the fly, from adding additional, any kind of additional reason or give additional criteria or make different decisions That is all prevented if you follow this process, right? So even I didn't mention it on this business plan, but even on the business plan, you must also discuss that, the questions that will be posed to the candidates who will be invited to the interview. And then you must discuss, like, who's going to, when are you going to develop those questions or design those questions? Are you going to call on the circuit manager, because the preface, the process makes that possible, that you can ask the circuit manager to assist with the development of that interview questionnaire and so forth. So yes, that's all the information. So on the competency based assessments, I don't know if Zahir is in the house, but you'll notice that the preface also states that all department heads, deputy principals, and principals will be invited to participate in the competency based assessments if the governing body decides to do that. But it's recommended in the preface. I see it's emboldened there, it's written in bold, but it's a recommendation. Okay. And the competency based assessments is just another mechanism, it's just another tool, another strategy to help the panel, you know, determine whether they have nominated the most suitable person for the post. So that competency-based assessments do not take priority. It's not a criterion that is a stand-alone. It's just an additional tool that your SGBs can use to help them see whether they have, in fact, based on all the information they got via the interview itself, and now that they're getting input from the CBAs, that assessment to help them determine whether they have made the right decision, and then they can finalize the decision in terms of, um, who they're going to prioritize, who they're going to rank first, second, and third. Now, the interview committee must remember that you must nominate 3 candidates. If you nominate fewer than 3, you must then motivate to the HOD why you've only nominated 1 person or 2 people for the post, and then the HOD will then make a decision. But you cannot just nominate 1 person and then say that that is going to be the nominee, your preferred candidate for the post, and because you're only nominating 1 person, therefore the HOD shouldn't have a problem with that, right? You are required to nominate 3, and if you nominate under 3 nominees to be considered for appointment in that particular post, then the HOD has the final say in terms of whether that is going to be accepted based on the motivation that you give. Still on the CBAs, I mentioned to Zahir last week that the competency-based assessments is exactly that. It's just giving you a profile of the person's aptitude, the person's attitude, and the candidate's behavior. But it's not an assessment or a test about your current performance or your current abilities. It just says what set of skills you have, what set of behavior competencies you have. And so it just sort of helps the SGB to understand, whether the person is the preferred candidate based on what they've seen in the CVs as well, and the way they've assessed and probed the person's skills in the interview. The CBA does not replace the interview. So you can't set questions that are, I want to say flimsy questions. You can't ask questions that are not insightful, that are not deep questions, and then you want to use the CBA to decide for you. Your questions must be well thought out. You must know what you want to probe, what kind of questions you want, what kind of information you want, what kind of evidence you want the candidate to show you. And then, in most cases, the competency-based assessments will, in fact, um, complement your assessment or your scoring or your, the process that you went through. In most cases, there will be some match between what you have discovered through your probing during the interview and your studying of the CVs and so on. Then in most cases, the CBA will just support that information, right? So it's about the future, how you're going to assist the person in future. So that information will also, from the CBA assessments, will identify the development needs of your candidate. So that means that if you know those are the development needs of the candidate that you have nominated, then the circuit manager and everybody else must then develop with the candidate, should that person be appointed, work on a development plan so that that person can strengthen his or her skills in a particular area. Okay, so I think I've said a lot. Okay, there's a lot of debate around the competency based tests, but it is done by psychometrists. It's you get the feedback, you get a profile of the person, but like I said, it's not it's just telling what potential the person has, what strengths they can pick up based on the behavioral questions they asked, based on the competencies they tested in the assessment, and so forth. So it doesn't mean that the test is an objective assessment. It's really telling you about your aptitude and about your behavioral competencies and so forth. Okay? Yeah, that's quite a bit of nagging about the CBAs, right? And then the last part, now let's see if I can get this thing to move to page 3. As showing me page 3, but it doesn't move to page 3. Okay, that is page 3. That was, sorry guys, that was page 3. Okay, so that in essence is what I thought I'll share with you. Just about the actual selection. Oh, what I probably didn't mention is that the selection process, you first have the sifting, right? So during the sifting process, that is just an objective sifting. It's just looking to see whether you have the initial qualifications, whether you have the teaching experience as prescribed by the post. If you're deputy department head, you need 3 years teaching experience. Deputy principal, you need 5 years. Principal, you need 7 years. So that during the sifting process, it will just check. Do you have the qualification, the minimum qualification of REQV 13? Do you have the teaching experience? What else? Do you have your 3 referees mentioned? Are you SAIS registered? And 1 or 2 other things. So that is just the initial check. Now, if you didn't, it's very clear when you fill in the e-recruitment that you need to give the names of 3 referees. So if you give only 2 referees, your CV will be disqualified, right? If you don't mention that you are SAIS registered, now because we're dealing with promotion posts, you should be in teaching at least 3 years for the department head. So you should be SAIS registered. If you don't have a SAIS certificate, then at least you should have the number on your salary slip, which the interview committee can request from you. But that is just the initial sifting, right? Not looking at your CV. It just says, have you got the minimum qualifications and the minimum information that will put you, allow your CV to be assessed and shortlisted? Okay. And then if you don't comply with those minimum requirements, your CV will be disqualified. The interview committee will make notes to say why your CV cannot be considered for shortlisting. And then those CVs that have complied with those minimum requirements will then go through the shortlisting process. And like I said, the interview committee would have already discussed exactly who's going to score, how the CV is going to be scored, what's going to happen if you have a tie, what's going to happen if you have discrepancies, what's going to happen if you what all the things that I just mentioned in number 2, in slide 2. Okay, Yeah. So let's see. So let me just say hi